There we are. I always get, I'm just going to change it to, there we are, get rid of, oh, I've got Jane on. I'm just going to get rid of that. Right, I've got rid of everybody. So I'll just go back to the title. There we are. It's always a great relief when you actually get the screen up. I'll always get a bit worried about it. So, as the title suggests, I'm looking at funerary monuments in Yorkshire churches. And one of the great pleasures in visiting small country churches is the discovery of the one, or perhaps often more than one, imposing funerary monuments. Generally, the monuments have been erected by a local landowning family who had the money to commission most fashionable London sculptor of the day. And though in Yorkshire we haven't actually got the magnificent ones of ducal families, we have got really some remarkable ones. The ones in other parts of the country are the great ones of the Marlborough family at Blenheim, but in Yorkshire we still have some which in many cases are works of art in their own right. So what I've done is select some that are either representative of the monuments, type of monuments of the period, or have an intriguing story to tell. So let's start the beginning 17th century. This one on the left-hand side, oh, it's gone back, there we are, in Gidding Church, is a rather bashed about monument, as you can see, of Sir Nicholas Fairfax, and it is actually, it says of his two wives, but he's got a wife on either side of him, you can't see the other one. And the one on the right is in Coxwell Church of Sir William Belasses and his wife Margaret. And Margaret over here was actually the daughter-in-law of, sorry, she was the daughter of Sir Nicholas Fairfax. So Sir William, when he obviously admired his father-in-law's monument, and so commissioned the same monumental mason, Thomas Brown. And Thomas Brown seems to have been the go-to monumental mason for all of the Yorkshire gentry, because we find quite a few of them around the country, around Yorkshire. As you can see, the monuments are still very much in the medieval mode, i.e. the figures are lying on their backs with their hands in prayer, facing the altar. At least Sir William Belasses and his wife are facing the altar, because this monument is probably in its original position, and though it's, as you can see, been repainted several times, it is in a it's been pretty well looked after. The one of Sir Nicholas in Gidding looks as if it has been in the wars. Some pieces have been knocked off. It's certainly not in its original position, and it hasn't even got a tomb chest. Underneath the tomb chest would probably have been members of the family, like the one that is in Coxwell Church. So, having looked at two monuments by Thomas Brown, we now move to Knaresborough, and this is a monument of the Slingsby family. Knaresborough is a very large parish church of John the Baptist, and it has the chantry, or it was a chantry chapel, but a chapel now of the Slingsby family with several of their monuments in it. And I think you can actually see the resemblance in style of the dress, particularly of the ladies. I think actually Thomas Brown just had virtually one style for ladies. They're all virtually identical in their clothes. The men tend to be always in armour. The one sort of major difference with the Slingsby one is that his wife, Mary, is on his right-hand side and not as it normally would have been on his right-hand side. And the reason for that is that Mary was actually the daughter of an earl. She was the daughter of the Earl of Northumberland, and in fact the sister of the Earl of Northumberland, who was executed for a rebellion, or being involved in a rebellion against Elizabeth. The Slingsbys and in fact the Fairfaxes were strongly Catholic families. The Belasses families were rather more careful about making it obvious their religion. Notice in this picture, if you look there, you'll see traces of another monument, and in fact one in the background there. We'll be looking at those later. We now move to Masson Church, to a remarkable monument erected by Sir Marmaduke Wyville to his wife. He had it erected in his lifetime, he predeceased him. It's a very fine monument in situ, but not actually, this is the big change really. Instead of lying on their backs, they're lying on their side, and they're not facing the altar. This is actually in the north aisle of the church. It has been suggested that it is possibly by Nicholas Stone, and Nicholas Stone was the most prominent sculptor of the day and was actually the sculptor to both James I and to Charles I. So Sir Marmaduke in sort of northern regions was certainly in touch with a fashionable London sculptor. And if you look at it, you can see that it is very finely carved. But unlike the one in, say, Coxwell Church, it's not been painted overall. This is partly because part of it, the main figures, are actually in alabaster and picked out in gold, though in fact this gilding will have been done or repaired later. So we've gone from recumbent effigies lying on their backs, hands in prayer, the ones who are lying on their sides but not praying. We now got to the next stage where they've actually got to their knees, again facing the altar and with their hands together in prayer. The one on the left is Thomas Hutton and his wife in Richmond Church. He again was a local landowner, and he certainly employed, I think, a local monumental mason, because compared to that Wyville monument we've just seen, it's very much provincial work. I think that the monumental mason has heard about epic figures, but he hasn't been able to interpret them very well. So you've got Fame here blowing her trumpet and some rather clumpy figures here, but it's not a great monument. It's one that is actually quite difficult to see. It is actually pretty close to the altar. It's actually in the chancel of the church, but it's rather high up. These two are actually much more sophisticated, and this is the one of Henry Belasses, who was the one that I mentioned, who ordered his own tomb and employed Nicholas Stone to do it. The one on the right is Henry Belasses' son, who actually became first Viscount Fauconberg, and his tomb is in many ways really most remarkable. It's often overlooked in Coxwell Church, but it is beautifully carved in both marble and alabaster, and all the correct architectural details. So, having gone from people kneeling, we've now got to them standing up. And we've gone back to St John the Baptist Church in Knaresborough to two other Slingsby monuments. This one on the left of Sir Henry Slingsby is quite remarkable. Here he is shown dressed in his shroud, in his as he would have been put in the coffin. And what is quite remarkable about this is he was actually copying something which had been introduced by John Donne, the poet, who was Dean of St Paul's and who commissioned Nicholas Stone again, name keeps coming up, to do his monument. And the story goes that he actually stood on a table wrapped in his shroud, obviously before he died, so that Nicholas Stone could get the idea of what he wanted. And remarkably, though obviously St Paul's Cathedral was destroyed in the Great Fire of London, his monument actually survived, and so you can still see it. And what again strikes me as extraordinary is that only 2 years later, Henry Slingsby commissioned this monument for himself, also dressed in his shroud. And at the same time, same year, a bit later, his brother, William, also died, and he commissioned a completely different sort of monument. So you've got really the dead on the left and very much the living on the right, because William is dressed absolutely in contemporary clothes, looks like a real person, perhaps a man in contemplative mood, but I think it's really been many ways, I think, my favorite monument. They both are attributed to a rather unusually named sculptor called Epiphanius Evesham, I'm ashamed to say, about whom I knew absolutely nothing till I came across the references to him. But virtually all of his work is actually in the south of England. William, whom I really quite, as I say, admire, underneath his monument, he had inscribed in Latin, which I'll give you the translation: "I depart, but not tired of life, nor yet afraid of death." So I thought that was a rather nice way of putting it. And here is yet another one of being buried, shown to be as you would be when you are buried. And this is a rather extraordinary lady, Mary Lady Bowles. She died aged 82 in 1662, and she's buried in Ledsham Church, which we'll see later. She, rather extraordinary, was created by Charles I, a baronetess. In other words, the female equivalent of a baronet. And apparently there's only one other example of it. Why she was given that, I wasn't able to determine. She was very wealthy, and in fact, she left an extremely elaborate will, perhaps like a lot of elderly widows, saying who should get what, you know, her second best gown and so on. But she also said in her will that she mustn't be buried till 6 weeks after her death. I presume she was frightened she might otherwise be buried alive. I don't really know. And she also left a lot of money for the funeral baked meats, and to entertain the large number of people she anticipated coming to her funeral. But what I find extraordinary is that there you are, 30 years after John Donne, she is also, and she had actually again determined exactly how she should be buried. There is one rather odd story I came across when I visited the church, that it is said her unquiet spirit haunts Ledstone Hall, where she was originally born, and also the area around Heathfold Hall, which is now demolished, but where she had lived. So when you visit these churches, you come across some quite interesting little stories sometimes. Here, just having a quick little lesson on theological and cardinal virtues. This is because we're going to be seeing quite a few of them in the next few slides. So theological virtues are faith, hope, and charity. Faith with cross, hope with an anchor, charity generally with children or babies. And the cardinal virtues, 4 of them: prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice. You can always spot Prudence because she's holding a mirror and has a snake around her arm. Temperance has 2 jugs, one for water and one for wine. And Fortitude is shown with a broken pillar, and Justice is shown with a sword and scales. And we'll see examples of them. And this is a remarkable monument in South Dalton Church. And you might think, oh, this is very odd, because South Dalton Church was actually completed in 1861 for Lord Hotham in South Dalton. But, and it was designed by John Loughborough Pearson. If you haven't been to it, it's a magnificent church, and no expense was spared on it. It apparently cost 25,000, which is, you know, a large amount of money. But it did replace a medieval church, which they pulled down. But what they preserved from the medieval church was this monument on the right. And this was a monument to Sir John Hotham. He died in 1689. The monument was erected after the death of his wife. And she determined in her will, she asked that her husband should have the same monument as Robert Cecil, Lord Salisbury, who's been buried in Hatfield, next to Hatfield House. He had been the great minister of James I. And what I find odd is that he died in 1612, and this monument, this is 80 years later, that she commissioned this other monument. And even in 1612, this type of monument was really quite old-fashioned. It's what's called a transy monument, i.e. one that shows the person as they were in life, in probably their ceremonial garbs, as here it is. He was the chief minister for James I, holding his ward of office, but underneath how he is, or how he will be in death. And so here you can see his skeleton, you know, no pretense about it. So, you know, in life and in death. And then you've got these magnificently carved figures of the virtues. So you've got justice in front of you here, there's prudence there, temperance, you can see the urn there, and you can't see a little bit of fortitude. And so they chose it, but it is, as you can see, slightly different. The ladies have got a rather more elegant outfits. I think, I'll just enlarge that. Their hairstyle is more fashionable, of the late 17th century, and their dress is slightly lower cut, looking very much like a Lely portrait in some ways. And so you've got Sir John in his armour. There you've got justice, temperance, and prudence is over there, and fortitude. There you can see in this picture of fortitude as well. And I'll just actually move this across, because the photograph doesn't show the skeleton so clearly, but if you notice, the skeleton is missing a right foot. it wasn't that he didn't have a right foot, but again, one of these intriguing stories that you come across. In the early 20th century, people found the idea of having a skeleton under the body rather distasteful. And so it was removed, this part of the monument, and put in storage in Dalton Hall. And Dalton Hall was, part of it was requisitioned during the Second World War, and the troops were stationed there. And one of them obviously looked into a storeroom, saw the skeleton, thought that perhaps the foot would make an interesting memento of his stay there, and removed it. That's all supposition. All we know is that the foot has disappeared. And also that by the 1960s, people weren't becoming quite so squeamish about having skeletons, so the skeleton was put back. So if you go to South Dalton Church, you can see this, you know, one of the most remarkable monuments really in North Yorkshire. And, you know, a very, very odd one in all sorts of counts. We will be looking virtually at all monuments that the 17th and 18th century monuments always tend to concentrate on the ownership of the people, where they got their land from, who they inherited. They don't very often tell you much about the people. So I put this one in because I think this one, I know that you can't always rely on as Dr. Johnson said, if you want veracity, you don't look at what's said on people's monuments. But this one does seem to be a monument to a really nice man. And it's written, you know, a friendly, courteous and charitable neighbor, of pleasant wit and agreeable conversation, cheerful, happy to himself, delightful to all who knew him, and so on. So I put this in, not that it's a particularly remarkable monument, but it seems to me a monument to somebody who was a really nice man. In fact, there are letters that he wrote to this man. In fact, they were brothers-in-law, Falkenberg, and so he got on very well with him. So it is interesting to the conversations. So we look now at much grander monuments rather than these don't say how nice either of these people were. The one on the right, I'm cheating slightly because of course it's not in Yorkshire. It's the one of the Beaufort family in the church in Great Badminton. But you can see it is definitely by Grinding Gibbons. It's a magnificent monument. And on one side, you've got justice, and on the other side, you've got prudence. And of course, he is reclining, but certainly he has, of course, also, as well as being Duke, he's got a crown waiting for him in heaven, which I'm sure he was pleased about. The one here on the left in Coxwell Church is of the first Earl Falkenberg, possibly designed by Grinding Gibbons. We don't have absolute evidence, but stylistically. And here he hasn't made a dukedom, but he has earls, so he's quite making certain that we know about it, holding the earl's coronet and seems to be offering it to his father who predeceased him. And his father is putting up his hand to say, no, no, a heavenly crown for me. And I think you can see the resemblance between that figure of the cherubs holding the crown there and that there. So it does look very much as if it's the same workshop. And again, the other, I think, a slightly amusing thing is they're all going to heaven wearing their periwigs, so that you've got the Earl wearing his court dress, the father, despite the fact he's dressed as a Roman soldier, wearing a periwig, and of course the Duke is wearing it. Nobody would have been seen dead dead or alive, I think, without their periwigs at that time. But both of them are very formal but magnificent monuments. So we now move south of the county down to two places. I always get muddled between them: Ledstone Hall and Ledsham, which is only a couple of miles apart. Ledstone Hall is, well, it was rebuilt in the 17th century, though it had been an earlier 16th century building. Belongs to the Wheeler Foundation Charitable Trust now, who inherited, we'll see in a moment. But when I visited it some years ago, 2013, see, it was virtually derelict inside. You couldn't go in because it wasn't safe to go in those rooms. But I believe it's now been done and converted into separate houses inside, but I have not been to it. But the people from Ledstone, who owned Ledstone, were buried in this beautiful church in the village of Ledsham, which is, as I say, nearby. The person who'd actually rebuilt the hall at Ledstone was Sir John Lewis. He was a London merchant, made a great fortune. He was a member of the East India Company, and his wife also had inherited a great fortune, so they were extremely wealthy, and he commissioned a fashionable London sculptor to do his monument. At least, sorry, he didn't commission it. His two sons-in-law commissioned the monument. It's not in its original position in the church, but it is beautifully carved in very fine quality marble, and it has recently been restored at considerable expense. And the sculptor who did the monument wanted rather like, I forgot to mention, that Thomas Browne in the one in Coxwold, so that you knew that he had done that one of Sir William Velasquez, had written at the bottom, Thomas Browne alone did carve this tomb from Hazelwood stone. So Thomas Cartwright here has written Tom Cartwright sculpture fecit. So in other words, he has made it. So, but I think when you look at the detail on Lady Lewis's dress, you can see it is absolutely beautifully done. Lovely carvings of the hands, and she does look very much like a Lelio portrait. And we're still in Ledsham Church, and this is to Sir John Lewis's granddaughter, who was always known, Elizabeth Hastings, which was always known as Lady Betty. Lady Betty Hastings was well known in her lifetime for her beauty and her piety. And in fact also a financial sense, which she possibly inherited from her grandfather. She used her great wealth very wisely, invested in it, and she left many bequests to charities that also carefully worded that many of the charities still survive today and in fact still can provide a considerable income. When she died, her tomb was designed by Scheemakers, who again was a London mason, and she's flanked on either side by her two half-sisters, and one half-sister is representing Prudence, again with her mirror and the snake, and the one on the other side is piety, not one of the cardinal virtues. But again, when I was reading about Lady Betty, that she died at age, I think, 53 of breast cancer, but the year before she'd actually undergone a mastectomy without an anesthetic, and apparently didn't even cry out at all. She, which is, I think, quite something. I'll just go back a moment because I missed that one. There you can see, you know, it's apparently it was based on a portrait of her, and she got on very well with her half sisters, despite the fact that previously her father had tried to dispute Sir John Lewis's will, but it was carefully tied up. So we now go to right in the, having been to the south of the county, up to Kirkleatham, which is near Middlesbrough. And this is the monument of the Turner family. They had been resident in Kirkleatham for several years. Like many of these families, they had made their money in trade in London, and they came back and founded first a school, Sir William Turner, and also almshouses, and the almshouses still actually survive. But the Cholmondeley Turner, who had inherited his uncle's wealth, was devastated when his son, who was called Marwood Turner, died on the Grand Tour. So he had his body brought back, and he had this mausoleum erected to house a statue of his son. And as you can see, the mausoleum here, and around it you can see it goes round to the memory of Marwood William Turner, and then eventually to, you know, the best of sons here. It was a mausoleum was put next to the medieval church, but that was subsequently pulled down, and John Carr designed this classical church. It's lovely inside. It's a very elegant building. And I was very warmly welcomed by the people when I went there, because the mausoleum is closed. You know, they opened it up so that I could see it. And this is what you see inside. Here is the monument to William Marwood Turner, also by Schumacher's, who, remember, had done Lady Betty's one. And here's the monument, and it says, memory of his only and dear son, Marwood William Turner, conveyed to Kirkleatham from Lyon in France, where he died October the 10th, 1739, the 22nd year of his life. And next to him, or across the other side of the one, there are a couple of other statues, but I had to call the line somewhere. This is to Cholmondeley Turner, the father, and his monument was carved by Henry Cheer, who was a very successful maker both of fireplaces, chimney pieces, and of funerary monuments. And I'm always amused when you can always identify a Henry Cheer piece, because I think he must have cornered the market in Sienna marble. And so everything, you know, even the chimney pieces always have a bit of Sienna marble in it. So you've got there in the urn. But he's in that fashionable, relaxed, cross-legged pose that became so fashionable in the mid-18th century. I think it was based on the statue of Shakespeare that Schumacher's that had done in Westminster Abbey. Oh, that's going past. There we are. So we now go to a monument that tells really quite a sad story. This one doesn't. This is in Hovingham Church, a very splendid Baroque monument to Thomas Worsley, who died in 1715. But this one on the right is, you would think, quite a simple, straightforward one, to Thomas Worsley, who died in 1776, I think it is, erected by his two surviving children. It says his third and only surviving daughter, and second and only surviving son. So all the others had predeceased them. And this one is the one that I particularly want you to notice here. The other ones were deposited in the church, but here you've got Henry, age 6, Charles, 2, Septimus, oh sorry, on back, Septimus, 0, Elizabeth, their oldest daughter, and Sophia, 10 months old, and they died in London, were buried in the parish of St. Mary le Bon. And I came across some years ago a letter by Thomas Worsley to a friend, explaining that he'd gone to the house just after his wife had given birth to Septimus, their son, finding that Septimus, the newborn baby, was dying, and so were all these other children, so that 5 of them died very shortly, one after the other. So they were buried. His wife actually survived and lived actually to a great age. Now we've moved to Goldsborough, near Harrogate, and this is a very fine monument in Goldsborough Church, erected by Elizabeth Byerley from Goldsborough Hall to her parents and her 5 siblings. And this is a very, I think you could describe it as an elegant monument by Joseph Wilton, who was sculptor to George III and was one of the founders of the Royal Academy. And here you've got 2 of the liturgical virtues. You've got Faith holding her cross, and you've got Charity with the babies, the children at her feet. And they are they're decorating an urn with a wreath. And it is beautifully carved. You know, the detail is magnificent, and see. And you know, he's carefully put in the little portraits of the members of the family there. We've now left basically the 18th century, but these ones of the 19th century, I think you'll see a change that whereas the 18th century, if they were expressing grief, they used emblems, figures, not representing themselves in grief, but perhaps statues of grief or charity or whatever. But by the 19th century, with the rise of sensibility and emotion, people were more likely to show emotion. And so this one in Thirlby Church, to the 4 children of the Franklin family, who all predeceased. Sorry. Something. They all predeceased their parents, and so you could see the premature decease of 4 dear children, 3 girls, Sarah, Amelia, and Marianne, who all were buried in the church, and Henry, who possibly was sent to Madeira for his health, I don't know, but who died in Madeira. But this is by John Flaxman, and it's a period he specialized in very much the sort of classical tradition design, and this is based very much on the Greek stela, apart from the fact that they are showing emotion. The parents are in grief, comforting each other, and you don't often get necessarily pictures, but I came across the very nice engraving of 2 of the girls. It was based on an oil painting by Hoppner, and down in 1795, when Marianne She died shortly afterwards, age 16, and Amelia died later, 5 years later, then age 23. But I thought it just brings the figures to life a bit when you see a picture of them. And this is a very touching monument. This is in a lovely little village called Hackness. I didn't take these photographs. Somebody I know who lives in the village did. And this is this very touching one by Sir Francis Chantry to Margaret Johnson, who died in childbirth. So her grieving husband is kneeling beside her, and she is lying holding the baby. The baby actually survived because in the monument it says at the back, you know, that they had 2 daughters. The eldest, Providence was pleased to recall, the youngest remains to solace her father in his affliction. And she was born, her father was Sir Richard Johnson of Hackness Hall, which you can see in the right-hand side of the picture there, and beautiful picture taken this year on a very frosty morning, and she was buried in that church. I'm slightly distracted. I'm having to hold the cat back with one hand, who's trying to walk over the keyboard. So I'll just have to get her down. Say hello. There you are. Now, again, this time, of course, grief is shown by a figure of piety. This also, I think this inscription does perhaps show that to somebody who was universally liked, Thomas Fairfax, who obviously suddenly died. It says on the monument, he was suddenly torn from his family, of whom he was the pride and delight. And it was after his death that they commissioned Joseph Gott to do this memorial. But as they had had a daughter who died earlier, they got him to incorporate the urn to both of them, so that piety is shown here clasping 2 urns with the daughter and the son's initials on them. And it's a beautiful monument. So remember, we saw the one of the earlier Fairfax family right at the beginning of the talk, and this is one near the end. But Joseph Gott was a sculptor who spent most of his time in Rome, and who was very much influenced by Canova, who just died after he got there. But this style, this very finely polished marble, and this is, I think, in situ, this one. Oh, this, I won't spend too long, but it's a really sad story. This is in Oswaldkirk Church, a local vicar, and within the space of, I think, 8 days, not only did his 4 children die, one aged 10, one aged 6, so on, eventually, and then he died. I think that monument must have been put up by the parishioners, but it's the sort of thing that did happen. You know, we are aware of infant mortality, was so common. We've come to the last few monuments, you'd be glad to know. By the middle of the 19th century, the fashion for going back to the medieval style of recumbent figures had come in, but this time done very much on speed, I think you would say. These great big marble figures. And in fact, I just happened to notice last time I was in York Minster that virtually every Archbishop of York in the 19th century was commemorated with one of these marble monuments. But this one is to Sir Charles Slingsby. So you see in the Slingsby Chapel, there's the one in the shroud, there's Henry over there. Sir Charles was drowned in the Nidd ferry disaster at Newby Hall in 1869. Most of you probably know about that. It was a hunt that was going to cross the River Ure on a ferry, and they all got on it with horses, and the horse panicked, overturned the ferry, and all went into the water. The river was in rushing along, and Sir Charles and 5 other people died, and some of the horses did as well. It caused a great sensation locally. There were thousands of people turned out to Sir Charles's funeral. He was the last of the line, direct line. His sister commissioned this magnificent monument by Joseph Edgar Bohm, who was originally Austrian, but who was the prominent sculptor in London at this time, and did a lot of statues for, well, both the nobility and the royal family. And he was apparently particular on this Princess Louisa, who was a sculptress in her own right, was very friendly with him. And in fact, he died suddenly while she was visiting him, which led to some sort of rumors about how close their relationship was. But let's concentrate on the monument to Sir Charles, which is a very fine one. Now go to Water, where the Church of St. Peter's was going to be demolished. It's a 19th century church, but due to the efforts of David Neve and other people, they managed to get a Wolds, made it into a centre, Wolds Discovery Centre. So it's a very interesting place to visit, and they have made a great effort to provide information of all sorts. But I went, of course, to visit the monument, and this is to Lady Isabel Wilson. She was originally, she also died in childbirth. She was actually buried in a mausoleum, which you got to through these magnificent gates. But when the church became derelict and was going to be pulled down, the mausoleum was actually pulled down. So they had to bring her monument inside the church, but the iron gates to the mausoleum they were able to keep. And so there are lots of very useful information. You can see it was done by George Frampton, who was the most sought after arts and crafts sculptor of his day. And it's, again, it is a lovely, beautifully carved. I mean, they really had achieved, I think, able to do these delicate details in the sculptures. And Frampton also did a monument to her father-in-law, Sir Charles Wilson, who was the most prominent ship owner of the time, based in Hull. And so Frampton designed this monument with references to his shipping line and to and to the city of Hull. The coat of arms for Hull were there. He lived at Water Priory, which was a great Edwardian house, or this Victorian house, which is now demolished. And we come to the last of these 3 great monuments, and this is perhaps the most remarkable. This is to a composer called Amy Woodford Findon. She was originally American, born in Chile of American parents, but eventually moved to England, married an English army officer and spent quite a bit of time out in India and Burma. She became well known for her songs that she composed, all based on Eastern themes. As you can see, the best known work was called The Lover in Damascus and Kashmiri Songs. I've never heard the music, but apparently last year they did have a music festival in her honor where some of her music was played. But the monument itself was commissioned by her sister and attributed apparently to some Italian, not quite certain of the name, but it was certainly carved by George Wade, who took over as the most fashionable sculptor of his day. And Pevsner, perhaps unkindly, said that it looked a bit like melting ice cream. I think you can see this, but it is, I mean, it's not, the church is picturesquely situated beside the River Nid, and you then go in and you just about fall over this great monument right inside the door. And so that you know some references to her work, you can see here, this is quite difficult to see, but they're actually carved mosques and minarets and things there, which I think is rather fun. So we've come to the end of our little rush through of monuments. I could have shown you many more, but I'm sure you're glad to know that I'm stopping at this point.